Thank you very much, Dan. That was fantastic. And actually, a couple of themes coming out from the panel and your talk about the kind of evolving role of the human data worker in AI. And that leads us beautifully, actually, onto a talk by a team who are doing so much to really spotlight the role of the human data worker when building AI, fast or slow. So it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage Mark Graham, a professor at the University of Oxford and Director of Fairwork, and Patrick Feuerstein from the Berlin Secretariat. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, you'll introduce yourself. And they're going to do an amazing talk about accelerating AI with ethical data work. Welcome to the stage.
Okay, awesome. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks to Prolific for having us today. Let me see if I can start my slides here. Yeah, perfect. So today is all about speed and accelerating development of AI. And that, of course, makes a lot of sense. It was already mentioned, the discussion in the last weeks about DeepSeek. I think that has put efficiency and speed on the top of many companies' agenda. And we already heard a lot about how to speed up development, but we want to talk about something slightly different now. We want to talk about the risks in AI development, and we want to talk about the risks that arise when you speed up things, or existing risks that become more significant when you do that. Risks, it's not something new for AI development, right? So we hear a lot about biased data that might create unintended output or discriminating output. We hear a lot about data privacy issues, in general security concerns. We hear about the lack of transparency, to only mention a few of the risks that are usually mentioned when discussing AI development. But we want to talk about a different category of risks when it comes to AI development that are not so much related to the technological level, but to the way AI is developed and the organizational structures in which AI is actually currently developed. I'm talking about the labor issues of AI. As we all know, the development of AI is heavily dependent on a vast amount of human labor. And these workers, predominantly situated in the global south, perform crucial tasks for AI companies, like data curation, data annotation, training the models, and in the end, monitoring the output to make sure that no unintended output is actually generated. And as you can see here, there's a lot of press coverage on that at the moment. These workers actually work in very different setups. So some might work via what we call online labor platforms. Some might work in BPO companies that provide these services to their customers. But still, a non-insignificant number of them experience the same dangerous and bad working conditions, no matter the setup they work in particular. And there's more and more studies that give attention to these issues and a lot of press coverage that puts emphasis on this situation. So to be sure, AI is not the first sector to experience this issue. So I've done more than 15 years of research on different supply chains in different sectors. Mark, director of the Feuerwork project, who's with me here today, has spent even more years studying the global outsourcing industry. So we know these issues from a wide range of sectors, from cocoa to coffee to textiles to electric light bulbs to even to chicken eggs. So there's been all over the place. And there's something that we can learn for AI from these sectors. And the first, and I think one of the most important takeaways, is that once these issues hit the public attention, they usually don't go away. So there might be some delay until a reaction is caused, but it never disappears altogether again. Then the second thing is that as a result of that public and political pressure, the companies in these sectors are constantly pushed to implement some robust due diligence mechanisms in their supply chains. And lastly, and this is for me, one of the most important points, that there's something to gain for first movers in this process. So companies who deal with these issues heads on and try to stay ahead of the curve, they can get a competitive advantage by doing that. So as we see it, the AI sector is currently at a crossroads. So first indicator for that is the issue has definitely gained public attention, as you could see on the slide that I just showed. Second is, it's not only press or some academics that point to these issues, but it's also the governments or some supranational organizations who deal with this problem and who implement regulation to mitigate these risks. You can see here, I think it's very small, so I'm not sure if you can read it, but you see a list of regulations that have been introduced in the last years to deal with due diligence in global supply chains, some from nation states, some from the EU, for example. And they all emphasize due diligence mechanisms in global supply chains. That will also affect the production of AI services, of course. We've seen in the last month there's a lot of pushback, particularly from the new US government on the regulations of AI. There's also negotiations happening on the level of the EU on the Omnibus Directive. So right now it's pretty hard to say what the regulatory framework or the field will look like exactly in the next 1 or 2 years. But one thing that we can be pretty certain about is that there will be some kind of regulation. So I think it's highly unlikely that we will go back to a world where companies are not responsible for what happens in the supply chains. And the last indicator that makes us think that there's actually opportunity right now for the AI sector to move in the right direction is that we already see first movers in the field. So we see a lot of the big AI companies dealing with that problem, putting that on their agenda. We also see a lot of joint efforts, for example, at the Responsible Business Alliance that represents one of the major players in the field. We also have the Partnership on AI that is organized by some companies to facilitate some discussions and joint efforts on this issue. And we also see a lot of discussions on the level of the United Nations or the ILO on that topic. So I think this is all indicating there's something happening and that people have started to think about that. But what we think is necessary for the AI sector to go forward is actually a set of benchmarks and guidelines that can be trusted because they are independent and objective, and that might guide the joint efforts both for suppliers and buyers in a supply chain. And this is exactly where our project comes in, and for that I will hand over to Mark to explain more what we're all about.
Thanks, Patrick. So hi everyone. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what we at Fairwork are doing about some of what Patrick was just talking about. So Fairwork, it was started in 2019, and what we do is we develop this set of minimum principles of decent work, of fair work. We turn them into a scoring system to allow us to give a score out of 10 to any company, and then we assess companies against those principles and give companies a score. And so we do that in order to encourage companies to embed at least these very basic principles of decent work into their operations. Now, we initially developed these principles 6 years ago or so at the International Labour Organization. We brought together a tripartite set of stakeholders representing industry, representing the labour movement, representing government. And we had a big discussion there at the ILO. The question that we put to everyone was simply, where's the threshold between fair work and unfair work? Where do you draw the line? What are the minimum standards that we can agree on? And then we took those initial principles that we developed there to workshops all around the world, initially in South Africa, then in India, then in Germany, and in dozens of countries around the world since then. We ended up with 5 principles that you can see on the screen there. And each one of those principles, each one of those 5 principles, we turn into two discrete thresholds. We start out with fair pay, the idea that every worker, irrespective of where they are or what they're doing or the type of contract through which they're doing the work, should be paid at least the minimum wage. And then the second threshold there, we ask that all workers are paid at least a living wage. We've got fair contracts, fair conditions, that workers should be protected from harms that they might experience in the workplace, fair contracts, that there's no unfair terms that are imposed on workers, fair management, that there's due process for decisions that affect workers, and that there's equality baked into decisions and management that governs how workers do their job, and fair representation, that there's freedom of association for workers. So what we do with those 5 principles and 2 thresholds is we turn them into this scoring system. So it allows us to give this score of up to 10 out of 10 to any company. So we do this, we collect data, triangulating methods. We look at the terms and conditions, the contracts that workers are given to see what's promised to workers. Then we speak to the workers themselves. So we do surveys, we do interviews, because sometimes what's what's a policy doesn't necessarily translate into practice. So we look for those sorts of discrepancies where they exist. And then we go to the management of companies. We typically go with a draft score or a draft understanding of where the company is. We give the company the draft score, and we don't just leave it there. We don't just say, here's your score, thanks very much. We then try and proactively work with the companies and say, well, look, here's your score, but here's the things you would need to do to improve your score. And that's ultimately why we're doing this work. We then put all of the scores that we have on league tables. We both have, you can see one example of just one single company scorecard on the right of the screen there. That would be the company Sama that some of you may have heard of. We scored them 2 years ago now. So we went in, we assessed them against the principles, and then we work with them to try and raise the bar to get their score up a bit. Sama made 24 changes in working with us in this round of assessment. And then we compare companies against one another on these league tables that you can see. The text is quite small for people in the back of the room. Prolific, maybe you can get a shout out here, they're third top of this list. But that's the reason why we put this league table together is really to try and show that it's not just that you can't make these broad statements about this sort of work is bad or this sort of work is good. We want to show the difference. So we want to show, look, here are actually existing examples of decent work being implemented, and here's the absence of actually existing examples of decent work being implemented. So really the point of all of this is to share best practice. Now we've done this, to date, we've produced over 700 assessments of companies in over 40 countries over 6 years. And in doing all of this, we've had 304 instances of what I described earlier, of companies working with us to make positive changes to improve their score and thereby improve the conditions of workers at those companies. So 304 instances of this happening against every single one of our principles. And we've done this work in 3 domains, really. So we assess companies that are online outsourcing, online remote work. We assess companies, online remote work platforms. We assess local platforms in the local gig economy. And we also assess companies in the BPO, AI, data work sector. So work like data annotation or content moderation. So when we're thinking about just the platforms that we score, when we're scoring platforms, there's a very clear incentive for platforms to improve their score because the platform name typically is a brand. And no brand really wants to be associated with poor working conditions or unfair conditions, exploitative working conditions. Every brand wants to be associated with being a fair, decent place to work. But when we're scoring the suppliers who are business process outsourcing companies, that's not necessarily the case. You get some BPOs like the example of Sama that I showed you earlier. They market their services as ethical AI, so they sell the idea that they're providing decent work to the workers who they employ in East Africa. So they have a vested interest in improving their score. But a lot of other companies don't trade on those sorts of terms, right? They're not household names. And what compounds this issue really is that when we talk to a lot of these companies, even the ones that really want to improve the conditions for workers, they'll tell us often there's very little that they can do because there's demands placed on them by the buyers, by the lead firms in the supply chain, and they've got relatively little bargaining power to push back against some of those demands because they're not consumer-facing brands like the lead firms and the supply chains are. And these suppliers, they're competing on price, they're competing on quality, they're competing, of course, on speed, but they're not competing on decent work. And so for that reason, at Fair Work, when we're thinking about how we want to bring about fair work throughout the supply chains of AI, what we're moving all of this work to is not just scoring the suppliers. So it's really the buyers who have the power to impose decent standards in the supply chains. And they can do this through their supplier agreements, and they can do this through their procurement policies. And so for that reason, what we've done is we've developed this certification scheme to work with lead firms who develop AI, who develop digital tools, who develop services, to certify them through this process in which we draw on everything that I just described, the 6 years of experience, producing over 700 scores, and constructively working with companies to then get them up to those minimum standards of decent work. So we're going to draw on that experience to work with the lead firms to embed these minimum standards into their supply chains, into their supplier agreements, and then score their suppliers' adherence to those standards. So I'll hand over to Patrick just for the last 2 minutes or so to explain about what this means in practice.
Yeah, thank you very much. Am I back on? Yes, I am. Okay, let me give you some more details on how Fairwork can actually help here. So if you look at a pretty regular due diligence circle that is based here on the OECD recommendations, Fairwork has actually a contribution for each of these 4 phases. So if we start in the upper left corner, risk assessment, that usually starts a due diligence cycle. The major problem that we hear from many companies that we talk about is that they have no idea how their data work supply chain actually looks like. So there's different departments working with different suppliers, and the company as a whole has no clue who's working with whom. So the first issue that most of the companies face is actually to get an accurate map of their supply chain. And we've done a lot of research in different constellations. We've done that on platforms, we've done that on BPOs. So we can help line out these or outline these supply chains for these companies, and by that identifying the risks that are present in the specific setup. At the same time, this is not only beneficial for the lead firms, but as you can see on that slide, the scores that we assign to supplying companies are also an important means for the suppliers to set themselves apart from their competitors and signal that to potential new clients, right? So there's also something in for the suppliers. Then the remediation phase, you're supposed to work on the risk that you've identified in the first phase of the exercise. So if we have identified the main risks here, we can help with the experience that we have from our research to come up with specific action plans to tackle these risks. And of course, we can also give advice to suppliers who actually want to improve their processes based on the good and bad practice examples we have from the industry to make some suggestion how some processes might be improved. Then monitoring and evaluation, that will also be part of the exercise in the remediation phase to come up with some KPIs to measure the effectiveness of the plans that are developed. And if you have that, you can also do that by continuous monitoring, by follow-up ratings. You can make sure that the plans that you've come up in the remediation phase are actually working and are actually mitigating the risks that have been identified. And last but not least, reporting. So Fairwork materials and Fairwork research is done according to the highest academic standards and is strictly peer-reviewed. So for that reason, it can also serve as a credible source for the reporting duties that usually finish the due diligence cycle here. Okay, and to finish, and then we can all go to lunch. I think that is pretty urgent at the moment for many of us. So to finish, let me just reiterate our key argument here. So as I said, we do not want to slow things down. We do not want to say that speed is bad, or we do not have to think about the efficiency of production processes. We just want to make sure that the risk associated with this, which might produce significant costs in the long run, both in reputation and financial means, and these risks might reduce or they have to be factored in correctly right from the beginning to make sure that you don't lose the competitive edge that speed was supposed to generate in the first place. That's basically our main takeaway here. And last words promised. So if you want to work with us, we are here. We are happy to work with you on that. And events like that are always a huge opportunity for us to not only work with the suppliers that we've done in the past, but also to get some contacts to lead firms in the supply chain who might be willing to work on this together with us. So thanks a lot for the attention, and then I think we can all enjoy the famous lunch. Thanks so much.